The Marines rely on these ships to be available to do their operations, and when they're stuck in maintenance, they can't use them.
Hi, and welcome to GAO's Watchdog Report, your source for fact-based, nonpartisan news and information from the U.S. Government Accountability Office. I'm your host, Holly Hobbs. The Navy maintains a fleet of large amphibious warfare ships that are primarily used for important Marine Corps missions. But the Navy has struggled to keep these ships available for operations and training, and in some cases, ships have been unavailable for years at a time. What are the challenges in maintaining these ships, and what's the impact of their poor conditions? We'll find out more from GAO's Shelby Oakley, who led work for a new report on this topic. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Maybe you can start us off with a description of what these ships are and why they're important.
So we've heard these ships described as the Swiss Army knife of the Navy. They kind of do a little bit of everything. These amphibious warfare ships, or amphibs, primarily provide transport for the Marines and their equipment like tanks and planes. But the Navy also uses these ships for other things like disaster relief efforts or to retrieve NASA spacecraft that have splashed back down to Earth. They currently have about 32 of these, but that number fluctuates as they build new ones and retire other ships. Only a small portion of these ships are actually available to conduct operation and training at any given time. Usually about like one-third. One-third are in maintenance, one-third operations, one-third in training.
And what do these things look like?
There's two different kinds of these ships. Amphibious assault ships, these are the larger ones. They look a little bit like aircraft carriers. They do things like deploy aircraft like the F-35 off of them. The other kind are called transport dock ships, and they help by providing the Marines with their landing gear for their shoreside landing. What they do with these ships is they combine them. 3 of them make up what's called an amphibious ready group. The Navy and the Marine Corps pair these two types of ships to carry about 2,000 Marines at any given time in something known as an amphibious ready group. That's what conducts training and operations.
What's the goal for these ships, and do the Navy and the Marines agree on that?
That has been the source of consternation and disagreement between the Marine Corps and the Navy over the period of time, the number of these ships that are needed to conduct operations and training for the Navy. Because of that long-term disagreement, Congress stepped in and said, you know what, you're going to have 31 of these ships. And so the Navy and the Marine Corps have been working together to try and figure out, okay, we have 31, but how many actually need to be ready and available for operations and training at any given time to meet the Marine Corps' needs. So this is an important distinction, right? Because historically, we have an example where the Navy had one amphibious ship that hadn't deployed in over 12 years because it ran into major challenges in modernization. But that ship is counted toward its number of available ships. The Marine Corps is like, that's useless to us if it hasn't deployed to be able to conduct our missions. And so really agreeing on that number of like, how many of these do we need to actually be not in major maintenance and ready to conduct operations and training? And that's one thing that they're working through right now.
So what is the status of these ships?
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the amphib fleet is in pretty poor condition. This is especially true for some of the older ships that account for about half of the fleet numbers. The condition of the fleet has really led to challenges that the Navy has had in deploying these amphibious ready groups, those 3 ships together at any given time. For example, recently, the Navy wanted to deploy a 3-ship amphibious ready group led by the Boxer, which is an amphibious assault ship, for a 9-month tour. But because of issues across all 3 ships that were supposed to be in that group, those ships only spent 2 of the 9 months together in operations and training. So it really didn't fulfill those needs.
Whether these ships are in use or not, that's got to cost money, right? Is the Navy just holding on to them?
So the Navy is proposing to divest some of them. Now, divestment is different than retirement. So retirement means I've reached the years of service and now I can retire. Divestment means I have not reached my years of expected service, but I'm going to stop using this ship before that time. So you imagine this is kind of a pretty important decision when you invest billions and billions of dollars in these ships to say, no, we're not going to use it for, let's say, the 30 years we expected to use it for. The Navy wants to allocate resources to different priorities like building new amphibious ships. But the Marine Corps is super concerned about these types of decisions because the Navy is going to be challenged to build new ships at a pace necessary to keep the numbers that the Marine Corps thinks they need to conduct their missions and operations if they divest of a lot of these ships.
So we've talked about the condition of these ships, but we haven't really talked about why so many are in disrepair. Do we know why?
Yeah, so over the years, GAO has done a lot of work in this area, and we've found that putting off maintenance or not conducting maintenance that's necessary is a key factor in why these ships are in such bad condition. Specifically in this report, we found that the Navy, who is responsible for maintaining these ships, frequently canceled maintenance for ships that it wanted to divest. So it made a plan. It said, I'm going to divest of X ship. We're going to stop doing maintenance on that ship because we're divesting of it. Turns out they don't always divest of these ships in the end, and that deferred maintenance becomes a major problem for the Navy going forward. A really good example is the Navy planned to retire the USS Fort McHenry about 6 years before it reached its expected service life, so divestment. That ship was poorly maintained, and at that time of that decision had about $146 million of deferred maintenance on it. This has been a broader problem that we've reported on. As I mentioned, the Navy has really neglected maintenance across its entire fleet since the early 2000s. Obviously, we were involved in a lot of conflicts around the world, and the op tempo was pretty significant, and maintenance really just wasn't a focus for the Navy. And they've taken a lot of steps to improve in that regard, but we're going to be dealing with the consequences of a lot of those decisions for many years to come.
So given all of that, is the Navy meeting the needs for the mission for these ships? And if not, what's the impact of that?
It's going to be really difficult for the Navy to maintain 31 amphibious ships in line with congressional direction and the needs of the Marines. It's probably going to require a lot more resources than the Navy currently has planned. And as I mentioned before, the Navy's not building new amphibs at a pace to be able to replace these ships in line with what the Marines' needs are. The Marines rely on these ships to be available to do their operations, do their humanitarian response or disaster responses. And when they're stuck in maintenance, they can't use them. That USS Boxer I was talking to you about was unavailable due to those maintenance issues. And the Navy and the Marine Corps couldn't provide support for international partner exercises that they were to be engaged in. They couldn't provide disaster relief in Turkey after the earthquake because of the condition of these ships. But I think really an important thing to emphasize is the Marines have to maintain certifications and training over a number of different areas. And when these things aren't available for them to do that, it can be a challenge to maintain certain certifications like launching an aircraft off of an amphib. And so it really affects the Marines' ability to provide a ready force.
Is there a baseline requirement or a minimum for making these ships available?
That's something that is currently being discussed right now. The Navy and the Marine Corps are trying to come to an agreement on what that means, what available means. They have taken a couple of first steps. They issued a memo this summer that outlines kind of high-level definitions for what they're talking about. But we could drive a hole through some of the criteria that they were proposing for, what available actually indeed means. And having that common definition is going to be important to drive resourcing decisions for the Navy about what it needs to do for these amphib ships.
So the Navy is responsible for maintaining 31 amphibious ships that are critical to the Marine Corps' mission. So critical that Congress has directed the Navy to make these ships available. But still, the Navy has struggled to do so. Shelby, given all of that, What more do we think the Navy should be doing to better maintain these ships?
Yeah, so we made 2 recommendations in our report. The first is simply the Navy shouldn't cancel maintenance for ships that it plans to divest before the end of their service lives. This has been a residual impact. It's not just an issue with amphibs, it goes across the fleet. Navy officials told us that they don't plan to do this again in the future, and that's great that they recognize that this was a problem, but we haven't seen this written down anywhere in policy. And why that's important is because, as everybody knows, when times get tough and challenges arise and resource decisions surface, a lot of times suboptimal decisions get made. And when you don't have a policy outlining what your stance is on it, we're concerned that this could happen again. In addition, I think we really want to see the Navy and the Marine Corps do more to define some more of those measurable goals and objectives for defining availability of the fleet to be able to ensure that the Marine Corps' needs are met for training and operations at the level at which they require.
And last question, what's the bottom line of this report?
These amphibs are really the linchpin of the Marine Corps' needs for amphibious training and operations. But unfortunately, lack of prioritization by the Navy has resulted in poor material condition of these ships, and these delays in their maintenance continue to affect how they can be available for the Navy to do the things that they need to do to conduct training and operations. The Navy really needs to tackle the root causes of what got us to this point and address them to ensure that we aren't just continuing to admire this as an issue, but that the Navy is actually going to take real action to address these root causes and make sure that they don't continue into the future.
That was GAO's Shelby Oakley talking about our new report on the Navy's amphibious ships. Thanks for your time, Shelby.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for listening to the Watchdog Report. To hear more podcasts, subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And make sure to leave a rating and review to let others know about the work we're doing. For more from the Congressional Watchdog, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, visit us at gao.gov.